Northern Italy, March 1945. A German observation post perched on a mountainside overlooking Allied supply routes. 2 sentries rotated watch every 4 hours, scanning the darkness for partisan activity. They were experienced soldiers, veterans of the Eastern Front, trained to stay alert and suspicious of every shadow. At 2:30 a.m., Corporal Hans Weber stood at the observation point, rifle slung over his shoulder, binoculars raised to scan the valley below. He heard nothing. No footsteps, no breathing, no warning. Then a hand clamped over his mouth, and something impossibly thin slid between his ribs. He tried to scream, to struggle, but the blade had found his heart with surgical precision. He collapsed silently. The British commando who'd killed him, Sergeant James Crawford of the Special Air Service, held a weapon that looked absurdly crude, a 6-inch spike of sharpened steel with a simple handle, no wider than a pencil, thin enough to slip between ribs without touching bone. The Fairbairn Sykes fighting knife looked too delicate to be lethal, more like an ice pick than a combat weapon. But it had been designed specifically for this, silent killing at close quarters. Its narrow blade created wounds that bled internally without large external trauma. Victims often didn't realize they'd been fatally stabbed until they collapsed from blood loss. The symmetrical double edge meant it could stab her any angle. The sharp point penetrated clothing and flesh with minimal resistance, and most critically, it could be drawn and thrust faster than any conventional knife. Crawford's partner eliminated the second sentry with equal silence. The observation post fell without a single shot fired, without an alarm raised, without the German unit in the valley below ever knowing their lookouts were dead. The commandos radioed Allied artillery, which spent the next hour destroying German positions using coordinates the dead sentries could no longer warn about. This is the story of the Fairbairn Sykes knife, and how 2 British policemen turned their experience in Shanghai's criminal world underworld into the most iconic fighting blade of World War II. Let's go back to 1940. Britain was organizing commando units, special forces trained for raids, reconnaissance, and operations behind enemy lines. These soldiers needed weapons optimized for silent killing, but conventional military knives were designed primarily as utility tools.
Bayonets were too long and awkward for close combat. Fighting knives from World War I were crude stabbing instruments without finesse. What commandos needed was a blade designed from first principles for a single purpose: killing enemy soldiers quietly and efficiently at close range. The weapon had to be fast to draw and deploy, capable of inflicting immediately incapacitating wounds, effective from multiple angles and positions, small enough to conceal but long enough to reach vital organs, and simple enough to manufacture in large quantities. The designers were unusual for weapons developers: William Fairbairn and Eric Sykes, 2 British police officers who'd spent decades in Shanghai's international settlement, one of the world's most violent cities in the 1920s and 1930s. Fairbairn had survived dozens of knife fights with Chinese gangsters, suffering scars from 19 separate blade wounds. Sykes was an expert in close-quarters combat and firearms instruction. Together, they developed a system of silent killing and close combat based on brutal street fighting experience. When the British military asked them to create a fighting knife for commandos, they applied lessons learned in Shanghai's alleys. Make it sharp, make it fast, make it silent, make it lethal. The result was a blade that broke every conventional knife design rule. It was symmetrical rather than single-edged. It was thin rather than robust. It had no serrations, no sawback, no utility features. It was purely a killing tool, optimized for a single terrible purpose. The Fairbairn Sykes knife embodied radical design choices that distinguished it from every previous military blade. Understanding these decisions reveals how combat experience shaped the weapon. The blade measured 6 to 7 inches long, depending on variant, long enough to reach vital organs through clothing and body mass, short enough for quick manipulation in confined spaces. The steel was high-carbon tool steel, carefully heat-treated for hardness and edge retention. Quality control varied across manufacturers, but the best examples held edges through extensive use. The double-edged design was revolutionary for military knives. Traditional military blades were single-edged, one sharp edge, one spine. Fairbairn insisted on symmetrical double edges because real knife fights don't allow time to orient the blade. When you thrust in darkness or during struggle, the blade needs to cut regardless of rotation.
Double edges guaranteed effectiveness from any angle. The cross-section was diamond-shaped. The blade tapered from both edges to a central ridge, creating a profile that concentrated force on a narrow edge while maintaining structural integrity. This geometry meant the blade sliced through clothing and flesh with minimal resistance, penetrating deeply with relatively little force. The point was needle-sharp and precisely aligned with the handle axis. Fairbairn's Shanghai experience taught that thrusts, not slashes, killed reliably in knife combat. The blade had to thrust straight, like extending your arm to point, without deviation or wobble. The alignment was so precise that users could thrust accurately by feel in complete darkness. The handle was formed from stacked leather washers, compressed and shaped to fit the human hand. The shape created a natural grip that positioned the blade correctly without conscious thought. In the original design, there was no guard. Fairbairn believed guards caught on clothing during the draw and slowed deployment. Later variants added small S-guards after user feedback suggested some hand protection was valuable. The weight balance positioned the center of gravity slightly forward of the handle, making the knife naturally point forward when gripped. This balance meant the blade tracked true during thrusts, without requiring wrist strength to keep it aligned. The physics worked with the user rather than against them. The finish was typically black or dark gray, corrosion-resistant coatings that reduced reflections that might betray a sentry's position at night. Bright steel would catch moonlight or searchlights. Dark finishes made the blade nearly invisible in low light conditions that defined most commando operations. The sheath was equally important, designed for silent draw. Leather construction with a spring retention clip held the knife securely during movement, but released cleanly when drawn. The sheath could be worn on the belt, strapped to the leg, or mounted on webbing in various positions. Commandos experimented with placement until they found what worked for their individual body mechanics and tactical preferences. Manufacturing was distributed across multiple contractors. Wilkinson Sword produced the highest quality examples, but wartime demand required additional manufacturers. Quality varied. Some wartime examples had softer steel, poorer heat treatment, or rough finishing.
But even mediocre examples were effective weapons, testament to the soundness of the basic design. Carrying the Fairbairn Sykes knife meant nothing without training in its use. The weapon's effectiveness depended entirely on the operator's skill, and both Fairbairn and Sykes developed comprehensive training programs for British commandos and special forces. The fighting stance was economical and practical. Blade held low, point forward, body positioned to protect vital organs while presenting minimal target. The stance wasn't theatrical, it was based on what actually worked in life-or-death encounters. Fairbairn had seen dozens of knife fights and knew that aggressive, committed attacks won, while elaborate techniques got you killed. The primary technique was the upward thrust under the ribs, angling toward the heart. Fairbairn called this the killing stroke. Blade enters between lower ribs, angles upward, penetrates heart or major blood vessels, causes rapid incapacitation through catastrophic blood loss. The victim might remain conscious for seconds, but couldn't call out or resist. Death was inevitable and usually occurred within a minute. The secondary technique targeted the kidney area from behind. Blade thrust horizontally into the lower back, severing the renal artery. This was the preferred method for eliminating sentries silently. Approach from behind, one hand covers mouth, blade enters kidney zone, victim collapses without making effective noise. Throat cutting was taught but considered less reliable than thrusts. Hollywood depicts dramatic throat slashing, but Fairbairn knew it was difficult. The blade had to be positioned correctly, applied with proper force, and drawn across vital structures without the victim pulling away. Thrusts were simpler, faster, more certain. Training emphasized speed of deployment. Commandos practiced drawing and striking in single fluid motions, reducing the time from concealment to strike to fractions of a second. They trained in darkness, with instructors attacking unexpectedly, forcing students to respond by instinct rather than conscious thought. The psychological preparation was brutal. Students were taught that knife fighting wasn't heroic or cinematic. It was ugly, intimate killing that required absolute commitment. Hesitation meant death. Half-hearted attacks failed. Fairbairn drilled into students that if you drew the knife, you were committed to killing.
There was no brandishing, no threatening, just immediate lethal action. Close quarters combat integrated the knife with hand-to-hand fighting. Commandos learned to use strikes, throws, and locks to create openings for knife attacks. The weapon worked as part of a combat system rather than as an isolated tool. A palm strike to stagger an enemy, followed by the killing thrust. A leg sweep to take them down, followed by a downward stab. The knife was the finishing move in sequences that began with unarmed techniques. Maintenance training emphasized edge care. The thin blade dulled with use and required regular honing. Commandos carried small sharpening stones and learned to maintain the blade in field conditions. A dull knife might glance off ribs rather than penetrating, potentially fatal failure during a sentry elimination where surprise was gone and reinforcements seconds away. The Fairbairn Sykes knife saw extensive combat use throughout World War II across all theaters. becoming the iconic weapon of British and Allied special forces. The operations ranged from the famous to the forgotten, but all validated the design's lethality. Commando raids in Norway used the knife for sentry elimination during approaches to targets. British commandos infiltrating German-occupied installations would silently kill guards using the techniques Fairbairn taught, clearing paths for demolition teams. The knife's silence meant raids maintained surprise until explosives detonated, often the first indication Germans had of attack. Special Air Service operations behind German lines in North Africa saw extensive knife use. SAS patrols eliminating sentries at Axis airfields before planting explosives on parked aircraft. The thin blade proved effective against Axis uniforms and equipment, penetrating without catching on webbing or gear that might slow thicker blades. The Burma campaign featured knife combat in jungle conditions, where silence and surprise were paramount. Chindit long-range penetration groups and other special forces units operating behind Japanese lines used Fairbairn Sykes knives for ambush and sentry elimination. The humid conditions tested corrosion resistance, and users learned to maintain the blade carefully in the hostile environment. D-Day operations included knife-armed commandos tasked with eliminating German coastal defenders before the main landings.
Commandos who landed ahead of the main force silently killed sentries and disrupted defensive positions, using knives to maintain stealth until conventional forces arrived. Office of Strategic Services operatives, American counterparts to British Special Forces, adopted the Fairbairn Sykes knife enthusiastically. OSS training included knife combat instruction from Fairbairn himself, and American Special Operations Forces used the weapon throughout the Pacific and European theaters. The effectiveness in actual combat validated the design choices. The narrow blade did slip between ribs as designed. The sharp point did penetrate with minimal force. The double edges did allow effective attacks from any angle. Veterans reported that the knife performed exactly as training suggested: lethal, fast, and silent when properly employed. Not all encounters were successful. Some sentry elimination attempts failed when sentries reacted faster than expected, or when attackers missed vital organs. The knife required precision. A thrust that missed the heart or major vessels might wound without incapacitating, allowing the victim to raise an alarm. Several operations were compromised when knife attacks failed to achieve instant incapacitation. The psychological impact on enemy forces who learned about the knife was significant. German and Japanese intelligence reports described British commandos as silent killers who murdered sentries without sound. Axis forces developed paranoia about sentry duty in areas where special forces operated. The knowledge that silent death could come from darkness, delivered by invisible attackers with specialized knives, affected morale and increased security vigilance. The Fairbairn Sykes knife achieved legendary status, but legends often obscure realistic assessment. Understanding the weapon's actual capabilities versus mythology provides balanced perspective. The blade was fragile compared to conventional military knives. The narrow profile that made it effective for thrusting also made it vulnerable to bending or breaking under lateral stress. Several examples survive with bent tips or blade damage from misuse. The knife wasn't designed for prying, chopping, or utility tasks. It was a specialized weapon that broke when used beyond design parameters. Knife fighting expertise was rare even among trained commandos.
Fairbairn could train basic techniques, but creating truly skilled knife fighters required extensive practice most soldiers never achieved. Many commandos carried the knife primarily as a backup weapon or morale booster, rather than a primary fighting tool they'd actually use in preference to firearms. The Hollywood mythology of dramatic knife fights bore little resemblance to operational reality. Most successful knife uses involved surprise attacks on unsuspecting sentries, rather than extended blade-to-blade combat. When commandos faced alert armed opponents, they used firearms or explosives. The knife was for specific scenarios: sentry elimination, silent kills, not general combat. The instant incapacitation promised by Fairbairn's techniques didn't always materialize. Human bodies are remarkably resilient, and even heart wounds don't produce instant death. Victims could remain conscious and combat effective for critical seconds, enough time to raise alarms, fire weapons, or grapple with attackers. Commandos learned that knife attacks required follow-through and backup plans. The emphasis on knife combat sometimes distracted from more important skills. Some military critics argued that time spent on knife fighting would be better spent on marksmanship, explosives, or tactical training. In reality, most commando engagements involved firearms or demolitions, with knives used rarely, if at all, by most operators. German and Japanese forces also had effective combat knives and trained soldiers in their use. Allied propaganda sometimes suggested the Fairbairn Sykes gave British forces unique capabilities, but Axis forces had their own close-quarters combat weapons and techniques. The knife provided advantages, but not insurmountable superiority. The romantic image of the commando with his dagger obscured the brutal reality. Using the weapon meant stabbing human beings at intimate range, feeling their bodies react to the blade, hearing their final breaths. This psychological burden affected some operators, who found knife killing more disturbing than shooting enemies from distance. Not all soldiers could overcome this natural human resistance to intimate violence. The Fairbairn Sykes knife influenced military blade design for decades after World War II, establishing design principles that persist in modern combat knives. The legacy extends beyond the physical weapon to the close-quarters combat philosophy it represented.
Post-war special forces worldwide adopted variations of the Fairbairn Sykes design. American, French, Soviet, and other nations' commando units created their own versions, recognizing the advantages of the basic configuration. Some modified the design, different handle materials, varying blade lengths, added guards, but retained the fundamental concept of a symmetrical, double-edged thrusting blade. Modern military knives diverge from the Fairbairn Sykes in recognizing that specialized fighting blades are less useful than general-purpose survival knives. Contemporary special operations forces typically carry utility knives, tools that can process food, cut rope, pry open containers, and perform dozens of tasks, rather than specialized fighting blades. The Fairbairn Sykes was optimized for killing at the expense of utility, a trade-off modern soldiers generally reject. However, the fighting knife tradition continues in specialized units. Some naval special warfare units still issue fighting knives descended from the Fairbairn Sykes, recognizing scenarios where silent sentry elimination or close-quarters combat remains necessary. These modern examples incorporate better materials and manufacturing techniques, but follow the same basic design philosophy. The knife became a symbol of elite warrior status. Earning the Fairbairn Sykes during World War II signified membership in commando units. The dagger badge worn by British commandos literally depicted the knife. This symbolic value persists. Special forces units worldwide use blade imagery in insignia, recognizing the knife as representing close-quarters combat capability. Civilian knife enthusiasts and martial artists study Fairbairn's techniques, often divorced from realistic combat context. The historical significance makes the knife attractive to collectors, while martial arts instructors sometimes teach commando knife fighting that bears limited resemblance to actual military training. The mythology sometimes overwhelms the reality. Museums display Fairbairn Sykes knives as iconic World War II artifacts. The Imperial War Museum, Royal Marines Museum, and various Special Forces heritage centers maintain collections. Many examples show combat damage, bent tips, worn edges, improvised handle repairs, evidence of hard use in desperate circumstances. Reproduction knives are manufactured for collectors and enthusiasts, ranging from historical replicas to modern tactical versions.
The market demonstrates continuing interest in the design, though contemporary users are largely ceremonial, collecting, or martial arts practice, rather than actual combat. The Fairbairn Sykes fighting knife looked too delicate for war, a thin spike of steel that seemed ready to bend or break on first impact. Veterans of Shanghai street fights and British weapons designers knew better. They'd created a blade optimized for a specific purpose, killing silently at close range. And in that role, it was devastatingly effective. The knife didn't win battles or change strategic outcomes. It was a personal weapon used in individual encounters, often by soldiers whose names are forgotten and whose specific actions remain unrecorded. Yet it became iconic, representing the commando spirit and close-quarters combat in ways no other weapon achieved. For commandos who carried it, the Fairbairn Sykes was more than a blade. It was confidence, capability, and commitment. It meant they could eliminate sentries without raising alarms, could fight effectively if surprised in close quarters, could strike from darkness and disappear before enemies knew what happened. That psychological value mattered as much as the physical weapon. The design philosophy, optimized for primary purpose even at the expense of versatility, challenged conventional military thinking that preferred multi-purpose tools. The Fairbairn Sykes did one thing superbly and everything else poorly or not at all. That single-minded focus made it revolutionary and controversial in equal measure. So why did this tiny British pipe dagger slice through enemy lines unseen?
Because Fairbairn and Sykes designed it specifically for silence and lethality. Because the narrow, double-edged blade penetrated between ribs without catching on bone. Because commandos trained in techniques that maximized the weapon's strengths. Because enemies died before they could cry out, allowing special forces to eliminate security without alerting reinforcements. The knife was unseeable not because it was invisible, but because it struck from darkness, wielded by men trained to approach silently, kill efficiently, and vanish before anyone knew they'd been present. The blade itself was just steel. The weapon was the complete system of approach, technique, and withdrawal that made British commandos terrifying to Axis forces throughout the war. Sometimes the smallest weapons are the most feared.
Not for the destruction they cause. The Fairbairn Sykes killed individual soldiers, not armies, but for what they represent, that nowhere is safe, that sentries can be killed silently, that special forces can penetrate defenses and strike without warning. That psychological impact extends far beyond the physical capabilities of 6 inches of sharpened steel. The pipe dagger sliced through enemy lines by giving elite soldiers a tool perfectly matched to their mission. And in doing so, it became something more than a weapon. It became a symbol of the silent professionals who fought in shadows and asked no recognition except the respect of enemies who learned to fear the dark. From fighting knives to time pencils to shaped charges, World War II weapons reveals how British innovation created tools that gave soldiers decisive advantages. Subscribe now for more incredible stories of weapons designed by experts who understood that combat is won through skill, silence, and perfectly engineered tools.